1 second here. Okay, we are live with our continuing series where we talk to professors, reporters, activists, anybody on the left, anybody on the right who can talk intelligently. And we're trying to get a lot of academics from left coast, middle, Midwest, South, East Coast, etc., from a variety of different academic disciplines, international studies, economics, political science, etc. And we have a big treat for you today, Professor Benjamin Studebaker, but you have to wait for 30 seconds while we do the intro, and we will be right back. Okay, a little bit of marketing I was told to do. Hope you enjoyed it. Hope it gets people jazzed up. Professor, let me introduce you, if I may. And you tell me if I got anything wrong at all. So today we're interviewing Benjamin Studebaker. He has a degree, PhD in the Department of Politics and International Studies, University of Cambridge. He wrote 2 different books. The Chronic of the American Democracy, I cut that partly off, I'm sorry. The Chronic something of American Democracy and Legitimacy in Liberal Democracies, both excellent books. He's an American with a PhD in Politics and International Studies from the University of Cambridge. He's a political theorist. He teaches and publishes in both contemporary political theory and the history of political thought. He's also interested in political economy, ethics, and international relations. Published academic work tends to focus on legitimacy. Also has a BA in politics from the University of Warwick and a Master's of Arts from the University of Chicago. He's also the winner of the prize for outstanding contributions to college education at Queens College. He's also taught all 3 of the history of political thought papers the University of Cambridge offers, covering the whole Western tradition from Plato through to the present day. His podcast, Political Theory 101, ranges even wider, incorporating theorists from China, India, and the Middle East. Here is that podcast where you can find Benjamin Studebaker. By the way, his link is at the bottom. You can see his name, title, and benjaminstudebaker.com about where you can find out more about the professor. Or you can watch this podcast, very entertaining. He's been around. He's been talking about democracy with a variety of different people. He's made me very jealous recently. I have wanted to be interviewed by Bree for a while. Congratulations, sir. These are the books, Legitimacy in Liberal Democracies. He hopes to explain the theory of the crisis of liberal democracy in established democracies like the UK and the US. In these countries, there is a deep dissatisfaction with political procedures, yet no credible alternatives have emerged. Another book that he wrote was The Chronic Crisis of American Democracy, The Way is Shut. This book argues that American democracy is in crisis. The economic system is slowly subjugating Americans of nearly all income levels and backgrounds to enormous amounts of stress. Can it be fixed? And finally, this is the show where I found the professor, and David McCarricker has also agreed to do an interview. I'm following up with him. Professor, did I get anything wrong? Did we say something incorrect? Is there something on the bio I need to correct, sir?
That all looks good to me.
Okay. So someone got elected recently, and this is after he survived 2 presidential assassination attempts. Just because you're the person that I have to be able to interview after the elections, you're progressive. Thoughts, feelings on the fact that a majority of American voters picked Trump famously in 2016. I'm here in California. Liberals said, well, maybe he won the presidency, but he lost the majority popular vote, so that means something. Not able to say that this time. In fact, he's won the popular vote. Senate looks like the House. So all that talk about how he doesn't really represent America is gone, that I saw Californians famously participate in 2016. What say you? Does Trump represent America? Is this another fluke? Did a foreign government put him in there? Only a minor percentage of Americans represent him? Or are we going to recognize that perhaps the majority of Americans do like this guy?
Well, he certainly won the election.
Okay.
I think there are questions about elections and how representative elections are, how representative American democracy is a system, but he won the election.
Sure.
I think it expresses the degree to which people are unhappy in the country and the degree to which they feel that the things that have been done, since 2008, perhaps, since that economic crisis, have not been sufficient. I think that there's been a pent-up frustration, a feeling that the system doesn't work, and a kind of searching that a lot of people have been doing for some way of changing it, some kind of alternative. And I think that we've struggled to provide an alternative that's compelling. And because we've struggled to do that, we keep getting Donald Trump.
So it's not necessarily political philosophy, it's economics, just pure economics. It's the economy, stupid, I think, as President Clinton famously said when he won his race in the 90s.
Well, I think that the economy is connected to a lot of other things. So I think, for instance, that one of the things that's been going on is a lot of people have gone to college, they've gotten degrees, and then they've not been able to get jobs that pay as well or produce the standard of living that they expect. And then there is a tendency for people who have been to school to hold on to the cultural distinctiveness, the cultural capital that they get from the university setting, and to use that to create a distance from people who don't go to college. And that has made it hard, I think, for people who go to college and people who don't go to college to work together on an alternative. And that's produced cultural divisions, which I think have economic roots, but have a lot to do with the sharpness of the polarization and the antagonism.
Okay. We'll loop back around to that. Let's start with the general questions I ask all the professors. Is political division real? Is it an issue? Is it bad? Or, come on, guys, that's just the media. They're looking for something to talk about. It's fine. You're a political scientist. You're also an American. You've been awake the last decade. Where is America today? Is political polarization an actual issue? Should we be alarmed, or nothing too much to be worried about?
Well, I think if you go into issue polling, you'll find that on a lot of issues, there isn't that sharp a disagreement. But when you start going into something like an election and who do people trust? Who do people view as credible? What kinds of sources of information do people trust? That's where you start to see much sharper divisions. I think that a lot of the focus tends to be on issue polling, and that doesn't always capture what's really important to people. Often the pollster has particular issues in mind that they think are important. They ask the public, what do you think about this issue? What's your position on this or that? But that doesn't necessarily capture what matters to the public. When I looked at what's the most important issue, what's the most important problem facing the country, if you ask it in an open-ended way and let people give whatever answer they like, there's really only maybe 4 answers that are very commonly given. One is cost of living, one is immigration, one is the state of the democratic system, quality of leadership, and then abortion is in the mix. But outside of that, there really aren't a lot of other issues that voters are immediately pointing to. So a lot of the conversation on the left, I think, which is focused on foreign policy, it's focused on the Israel-Palestinian question. I think a lot of that isn't resonating very much with the public, in part because U.S. troops are not deployed in large numbers to the Middle East at this time as they were, say, 20 years ago during the Iraq War. So the issue is not as resonant with people. And I think, when you think about immigration, I think a lot of people on the progressive left think of that as an issue to do with race or racism. But in talking to people who are Republican, and my home state is Indiana, so I know quite a few, a lot of the focus tends to instead be on legality, questions of whether the immigration is legal or illegal, rather than who it is or what country they come from.
Right.
And then also a sense that housing has become very expensive and that people entering the country are making housing more expensive, which I don't necessarily think is true. But I do think that it shows that when you have a problem like housing, where housing has gotten significantly more expensive, in part because the interest rate has gone up a lot, that is going to cause people to look for explanations easy to hand for that. And if there isn't really an effort going on to frame that problem in some other way and to do something else about it, if all you're really getting is a little bit of talk about some down payment assistance, which people tend to think will just further increase the price of the homes, I think that really didn't work. I think people didn't see Harris as having a comprehensive solution to that problem. And particularly when Harris would get asked questions about what she was going to do different from Biden, she didn't have comprehensive answers to that question ready to hand. So I think a lot of people felt that the problems that they were seeing weren't going to be addressed in a Harris administration, or if they were going to be addressed, it would not be in a way that would dramatically change the situation. And therefore, they looked for whatever else was out there. They voted against incumbents. I think that really is the crux of it.
So I hear what you're saying, and a lot of people have said that. When you look at actual issues and you survey the American public on like gun security and abortion, there doesn't seem to be that large a divide between the left and the right when you actually boil it down to just the issue and you pull away all the emotionality and the bickering and the key phrasing, etc. At the same time, many professors have said that we're in a period of political polarization. Some professors have said, I'm not joking, that the level of polarization today resembles the period right before the Civil War, including professors at Stanford and Harvard. We also had January 6th. Nobody stormed the Capitol since 1812. We've also had a president say that, let's just not recognize that the last guy was legitimate. That was Trump on Biden. But even before then, we had Hillary Clinton say, let's say that Trump's not a legitimate president for 4 years, based upon Russia collusion, which was disproven by the Durham report. So now we have two administrations where it's, I reject your guy was elected president ever for the next 4 years, and then someone else does it, and capitals are being stormed. That's a little bit chaotic, isn't it? These can't be good signs, right? Do you think that there's something going wrong here? Or I've heard the other refrain. The 1960s were tough. We got through them. We'll get through this just fine. Are things as bad as the 1960s or the Civil War period, or are they just bad in general, or is it overblown?
I think it's a different kind of bad. So I think in previous periods, there has been real concern on the part of people running the government that there could be some kind of revolution, some sharp conflict between society and the state, where the one would be pitted against the other and there could be a transformation of the entire political system. I think because of the legacy of the 20th century, because of the world wars, because of the legacy of the Soviet Union, Nazi Germany, there isn't really a feeling among a lot of people that there's some other political system that they could potentially implement.
Yeah.
Nonetheless, they feel like this system is not solving their problems, is not dealing with them in the way that they'd like to be dealt with, isn't recognizing them the way they'd like to be recognized. But because they don't have something else to hand that they think would be better, that they could simply implement through revolution or strike action or by taking to the streets, there's a certain toothlessness to a lot of the political action, a certain ironic distance, a little bit of an unseriousness to it. Nonetheless, there is very deep dissatisfaction. It just doesn't have a clear mechanism for being expressed. So it's tending to be expressed in terms of, say, voting ironically or voting in a non-serious way, not taking the elections fully seriously. I think it's also occasionally being expressed in terms of large numbers of people going out into the streets for various reasons. But these people are not looking to overthrow the government. If they have some level of success, they are surprised. The thing that struck me about January 6th is how surprised people were when they got into the building, and
Right.
They didn't really seem to know what to do. They were upset about the election, but they didn't really have a positive plan. So when they achieved what would seem to be their goal of getting into the building, they were just confused. They were not there to overthrow the federal system. They would never have imagined that they could do that. And having gotten into the building, they didn't know what to do and were confused. And I think that that really is the trouble. Everybody's confused about how this system works. There is still an agreement very, very minimal level of agreement that democracy is the only system of government that we can have.
Sure.
But what does that mean? What form should that take? What procedures are required to have a real democracy? Should we have a democracy or a democratic republic? Some of these kinds of questions get thrown up. But for the most part, there are no clear answers to any of these questions. All people really seem to know is they don't want communism. They don't want fascism. But as for what we positively should have at this stage, I don't think people are really clear on that, on either side, really.
Interesting. Interesting. So, if I may, January 6th happened. Yes, that was bad, but it didn't look like it was well thought out and it wasn't part of a larger political scheme. And so therefore it's not as threatening as say the Cold War, where there was actually an alternative to democracy. We're not actually talking about people pulling away and fundamentally forming a different type of government. They both agree on roughly the same type of government and democracy. And they really only care about four issues, and they're not that divided on other issues. So we don't need to put too much concern into January 6th type events. Is that fair?
That's not to say that there aren't small numbers online of neo-reactionaries, people with very, very out there authoritarian politics, but these people don't have deep connections, deep roots in society to, say, the broader Trump movement.
Yeah.
Or, conversely, there are people who are very communist in their language and in the signifiers that they would use online on social media. But that doesn't mean that those people have deep social roots or deep connections to the Democratic Party. And I think there's a tendency, if you're not in either of these movements, to look at it from outside and to see all of it as all of a piece. So if you're in the
Right.
Democratic Party or on the progressive side, it looks like the right is all one big thing. And conversely, for them, it looks like the left and the Democratic Party are all one big thing. And so it's easy for them to say, Obama is an Obamunist, and to associate him with Lenin and Trotsky and Stalin and Mao, all those memes that the right put out during the Obama administration, aligning him with those figures. And conversely, I think it's become very easy for Democrats, progressives, and the left to do the same thing with, say, Trump and Hitler and Mussolini. But I think in both cases, this comes from the estrangement and from the fact that most people are not talking very often to rank and file Trump or Harris voters. Insofar as they have exposure, it's to the most extreme examples that pop up on their timeline or that are put in front of them as opposition research.
Okay. So these pundits and experts who are telling us about the political system right now really aren't paying attention to the average Americans. They're focused on the most extreme. And so it looks like it's very extreme, where the average people are kind of more milquetoast in the middle of the ground. But they're not actually talking to regular folks on the ground. And so the picture they get is that everybody's an extremist. Is that fair?
Yeah, and many of the people who are ordinary voters, their exposure to the other side is through the internet and through the media. So a lot of people, even ordinary people, have an impression that the other side poses a danger to them or a threat to them. But I think what unites Republicans and Democrats together is that each of them is scared that somebody's going to destroy democracy or take democracy away. It's just that threat is projected as coming from the other.
Yeah. Yeah. So is this part of the theory that I forget the name, but basically a lot of professors have brought this up. So Republicans would think Democrats would 90% support abortion when it's only like 60%. And Democrats would think that Republicans would love storming the Capitol at 90% when really it's only 50%. So you have this idea and you inflate the number of people who would believe in an extreme thing. And both sides seem to do that. There seems to be a lot of discrepancy. The opinions Democrats have of Republicans on many issues, they're not as extreme on the same thing. Opinions Republicans have of Democrats, you all want communism, you want transgendered surgery for every 12-year-old child, etc. The actual support for that isn't extreme as Republicans in their general mind would think. Is that roughly what you're getting at?
Yeah, and I think that a lot of people's voting, because it isn't positively motivated by a belief that there's something that their party will do that will make life much better for them, is instead based on a fear narrative about what the other side will do.
Right.
So there's a heavy incentive for both parties to portray the other party as posing this grave threat. so as to get people to turn out, precisely because both parties have lost a lot of ability to do things positively that their supporters look at and go, this is great, this is what I'm looking for. So the parties now position themselves as protecting their voters from the other side.
So yeah, they don't have new ideas. They don't have new concepts that they can attract new people in. It's more of fear of loss. The other guy gets in and they're going to take away everything that you have, and we're the only one protecting you. And unfortunately, in psychology, as it's been explained to me, if I say, "Hey, I got $5. Do you want it?" You probably won't fight for it. If you already own the $5 and I say, I'm going to take your $5, you'll almost fight to the death for it. We're programmed that way. So we won't jump for gain, but we will immediately go knives out for, if you're going to take anything from me, I feel a sense of loss. I must defend myself. And that's somehow inherited into us. No, I mean, it's not a good sign, though. Is that fair, Professor? That because I remember when in elections they tried to reach out to the swing voter, they tried to swing people's opinions. Reagan, Clinton, etc. Now it sounds like they're not even trying to do that. It's really just focus on your base and terrify the hell out of your base so you get them to turn out, because the idea of reaching out to the other side is really impossible.
Yeah, I think for both sides, there's a continuing process of depoliticization that they're trying to fight against with the fear narrative. So in both cases, people are getting worn out. They're losing their belief that the party that they've traditionally supported will be able to deliver for them. And to prevent these people from dropping out of the electorate, or to reactivate them if they have dropped out for some period of time, this fear narrative is invoked to create a sense that even though you don't believe that you're going to get something out of the next election, you have to vote to prevent the other from getting the bad thing.
That's brilliant. When do you think that started?
I think that there's been a gradual drift in this direction. I would think back to Newt Gingrich, even in the 90s. And Newt Gingrich was the first Speaker of the House to have first gained his position through the modern primary system implemented after 1968. So I would see some connections to that. But I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that they aren't able to do as much. If they were able to do more positively, they might still be running more on positive proposals. But because successive presidents have struggled to fulfill hope narratives, there is now this concern that if you promise stuff and you're not able to do it, you'll have disappointed people, disaffected people who will drop out. And there has to be some way of keeping those people engaged. The parties are really oriented toward getting votes. If you have an electoral system, gradually what will happen if you professionalize that and put a lot of money into it and create a lot of jobs around it, is that people will get hyper effective at thinking about what will increase the vote count as much as possible. And so we have a kind of competitive game that has been almost played too much, to the point at which people have gotten too good at it. Okay. And it's starting to malfunction because people are engaging in strategies that are effective at winning the game in the near term. They will turn out voters this cycle, but have long-term negative consequences on the quality of the discussion.
To win. I just want to get this up. So the strategies: do whatever it takes to win now. Who gives a damn about tomorrow? Because we wouldn't be in power. I've seen multiple politicians say it's about being in power and winning elections. And they're like, well, Hillary this and Biden, you didn't do that. It's about winning. That was their response. So it sounds like that's what you're saying. We've got to win, whatever it takes to win. Who cares about the long-term consequences? So if we paint our opponent as an existential threat, the end of democracy, the end of America, and that gets us a win now, that's fine. Who cares if we actually build deep-seated resentment in the population that will boil over in 10 years into another January 6th? We won this election, so we're cool. Is that a fair summary?
Yeah. And if you had a different strategy, you would be less competitive. If someone is always doing whatever's necessary to win the election and you're compromising that in relation to any other values, goals, or projects that you might have, you're going to lose. And so the tendency is to have politicians who are better and better and better at winning elections, but worse and worse and worse at governing.
That was one of the things that I noticed was that, Ronald Reagan was an intense partisan, and he would make a lot of jokes on the Democrats, and he would definitely draw a big distinction between the Republicans and the Democrats, and he'd kind of poke fun and try to get people to laugh at him. But he passed a lot of laws and a lot of legislation, and he would, for every time that he slammed the Democrats, he would say, "But I'll work with Tip O'Neill and we'll get something done." And he got a lot done. I'm not endorsing the man. I'm just pointing out the difference between then and now. And now it seems like we got Reagan's ability to slam people, but no redeeming traits, no mention that I'll work with the other side, and no ability to get any legislation passed. That can't be a good evolution, right?
It seems like also every 20 years or so, there's a nostalgia about the ability of the politicians 20 years before to work with each other, right? So lately, there's been this nostalgia for
Fair.
Bush, and for Liz Cheney, Dick Cheney, the Bush era
Sure,
Republican
sure,
Party, and then during that period, there was nostalgia for Reagan, and then in the Reagan administration during the 80s, there would be nostalgia for the 60s and for the quality of cooperation and discussion that occurred during that period, during the post-war era. I
sure.
think that there has been a general tendency over the course of the last 70 years or so for this to get a little bit worse gradually over time.
Originally, you said maybe Newt Gingrich, but now if you're looking at 70s, you're pushing back to 1950s when it starts.
Well, I think the post-war system had certain problems in it that have gotten bigger over time, and gradually over time, they've forced further changes that have made the situation worse. So immediately after World War II, there were very heavy trade restrictions. Workers in the United States had their jobs very much protected from competition from workers
Right.
in other parts of the
Yeah.
world. And then there
Right.
was gradually an effort to open up the global trade system and include more countries in that system, initially Germany and Japan, then eventually China. The Bretton Woods system was taken apart in the 70s. And then after the fall of the Soviet Union, the former Eastern Bloc countries were integrated into the system. So gradually, there's been more and more competition for jobs. And in the 70s, a lot of the focus was on, if you get a college degree, if you get educated, then that will give you an advantage in the labor market. So even though we're including all these other countries in terms of industrial trade, there will be a shift in the kinds of jobs that people can do. And Western workers, because they'll be more educated, will be competitive for those higher skilled jobs. And that will make it okay that increasingly there will be competition for industrial jobs with workers in other parts of the world. And I think a lot of people in the 70s and 80s accepted that argument, went and got university degrees, but ultimately there haven't been enough very high quality university jobs for them. There have been some, but not enough for all of them. And that's produced a large section of people with college degrees who are carrying a lot of resentment that they did what they were told, what they were encouraged to do, but didn't ultimately get the reward that they were promised. And I think that as this has happened, as it's become harder for traditional workers, blue-collar workers without degrees, to do really well, to get defined benefit pensions and industrial jobs in factories, and there's been this saturation of the professions at the higher end, there have been two different chunks of Americans who have been getting increasingly stressed out and frustrated over the length of this period. And then as this has happened and the politicians have, and media and so on, have focused on winning elections, they have gotten better and better and better at activating this resentment and using it to win elections. And in the course of doing that, they've fueled the resentment, and they've not governed the country in ways that would dissipate it or allow it to resolve. So there's a kind of vicious cycle with all of this. There's a vicious cycle of economic change that subjects people to stress, politicians looking to win elections, capitalizing on that stress and worsening it in the process of capitalizing upon it.
I heard the term called doom spiral by other professors.
Yeah.
That was just something I heard. And it's related. They were talking about how we live in a time now where if you're a news agency and you show some politician say something extreme, you'll get a lot of views. You get a lot of views, you get advertisement. That's money. Politicians know if they say something extreme, they'll get a lot of media agencies to cover them. When they get coverage, they get donors. That's money. So now there's this cycle of I say something extreme knowing you're going to cover it. Oh, great. I'll cover that because that's money. Great. When you cover it, I get money. So now we all make money. by me saying something extreme and you showing it. And there's no real benefit to me saying something sane or reasonable. That's boring. That's not going to get coverage. And then so far I won't get the money. So I got to say something really shocking and damning about the other person that's, going to get people's attention. And then the media love me, and then I get more cash. And frankly, that's how you win elections: exposure and money. And they called that the doom cycle. It relates to what you're talking about, I think.
Yeah. And I think if Americans were doing better, if they were happier, if they liked their lives better, if they had more time and energy to think about things, they might be more likely to reject that kind of messaging. But because these economic changes have occurred in the background and people have been subjected to all of this stress, they're very vulnerable to this kind of messaging. And that's why that messaging is the most competitive kind of messaging. I think we could imagine a different kind of society where people have more time and are more able to think clearly because they have more time and energy about this, where that kind of messaging would not be as effective and people wouldn't like it. And if that were the case, then these people who are trying to win elections would message differently. They're messaging this way because the public is in a condition such that that kind of messaging is effective.
So what I think you're saying is the polarization amongst the American people isn't, hold on, this is a whole statement, isn't real in the way that the media is presenting it. We have long-term economic structural stress issues that go way back to issues and decisions that we've made. And they frankly resulted in most Americans not doing better. And so now we're dealing with a nation where a lot of people know that they're not doing as well as their parents or their grandparents, and which was the American dream, right? That was the concept of America for the last 2 centuries. I did better than my parents. Now you have, I think, going on 2 generations where they have to recognize I'm part of the generation where that's never going to happen. And that builds resentment and depression. And then people get angry. And now they're looking for someone to blame or someone to save them. I remember reading the book by Erich Fromm called Escape from Freedom. He was a German who was living in America right after World War II. And he was ethnic German, but he was an American, and he was horrified by what his fellow Germans did. He had just left a few years before, and he's like, what's going on? And he interviewed him, and what he found out was the German people were scared. They were scared about inflation. They were scared about invasion from France. Hitler kind of hyped that up. And then he said, I'm the only guy that can save you. And when people are terrified of this issue and that issue, and our currency can't work, and what are we going to do with our borders, and what if England and France invade us, and what about this, and what about that? They go, this guy appears and he goes, I have the answers to everything. Don't worry. I've got the answers to everything, and I'll fix everything, and I'll make everything work better. Well, they're like, all we have is chaos and confusion. Of course I'm going to vote for you. And so they rushed to him. And I see similar sentiments now, especially when I see people voting, at least in my opinion, partially some of the votes for Trump. I'm scared of this. I'm scared of that. I'm scared of this. I'm scared of that. And then Trump comes on and says, only I can fix these problems. And I know a lot of Trump supporters. I'm related to some of them. They really believe that. How do we get out of this other than making the economy as good as it was in the 1960s, which would kind of mean undoing global trade over the last half century? How do we do this, Professor? How do we fix this? Here's a magic wand. Sorry, this is something I do. Here's a magic wand. This looks like a pin. It's actually a magic wand. I'm going to virtually hand it to you. When you have this, you have the ability to go, poof! Anything you want would change the American people, change the economy, change the way they think. What would you do to change America so that everything snaps back to place like it was in the 1960s and we're not angry at each other anymore?
Well, I don't think it would work to tear up all of that global trade, because at this point we're accustomed to buying and purchasing goods at a price point that would not be possible if we had that kind of economy. And also the way things are manufactured is so different now in terms of the number of people who work in factories. We could never get back to the kind of situation we had in the 50s and 60s. Nonetheless, I think there are certain conditions that came out of that situation that we have to find some other way of producing in terms of stability for people, in terms of reducing the percentage of the economy that is stuck in the healthcare system, which is now up to 17%. It's an enormous percentage of total GDP. I think if I could wave a magic wand, the number one thing I would do is get the United States and China in a dialogue about rewriting the rules for global trade so that we don't have an international system where there is an incentive for people to move money and jobs around the world on the basis of tax breaks, regulatory breaks, low wages. We need a fairer set of rules for global trade that prioritizes the need for workers in every part of the world to have a greater level of stability. A big part of the immigration crisis is driven by the fact that in many countries where people are coming from, there isn't enough stability.
Thank you.
People move up here looking for that stability. And I think that one way that we could do that is to actually get these states together on new rules that would make it easier for people to stay where they are if they'd like to. That would make it easier for people to have access to basic services, basic things they need, so that there isn't a constant competition, which I really think is for one, it's a race to the bottom. It produces a situation where the tax base is too low and our ability to fund public services deteriorates. And so we have problems like we've been having with our schools, where there's just not an adequate amount of resources to pay our teachers decently. And so the quality of our teachers declines. And then this produces suspicion of the public school system, and it forces our schools and our education system to have to rely more on hard rules that anyone can follow, because there's been an erosion of the teaching quality because the teacher wages are not high enough. I think that's a huge problem that really is at the root of a lot of what's wrong. But that comes back to there's no tax base. The states are competing with each other on tax rates to attract business. There needs to be a universal set of rules, and I'd like it ideally to be global. I would like the United States and China and the European Union and India to get together and write some rules and say, if you're a smaller state and you want to trade with us, you've got to follow these rules, and make a large cooperative bloc that would. But it might not be possible to do that on that scale. It's very difficult to get the level of cooperation necessary for that. At the very least, I'd like to see something like that internally within the United States. I think at this point, our states are competing on tax rates to a point where they really struggle to fund public services adequately. And this puts an enormous burden on the federal government to constantly make up for the fact that the states aren't raising enough money themselves. And that forces the government to become more dominated by the feds, because the feds can borrow money, they can print money, while state governments can't do those things. A lot of people on the right who are concerned about the weakness of the state governments need to bear in mind that lower tax rates at the state level mean that the state government has less pull and is more dependent on the federal government for resources, and therefore has less autonomy to make policy differently. If we create sets of rules that everybody follows, it actually increases the freedom of individual states to differentiate and try different things and experiment, because they know that they will have resources to fund the government, even if they differentiate and try different things. If we want the states to be these places where people experiment with different arrangements, there has to be some level of secure funding. And that's true both internally within the United States and globally among different nation states around the world. So that's really what I think ultimately is necessary. The difficulty is that requires a lot of explanation and a lot of talking about the history of the economy, and what is competitive in terms of winning elections isn't that. It's a different kind of language.
I remember there was a guy called Donald Trump, and he said we have to write the rules for global trade. We're not being treated fairly. And half the country said you're a racist monster who hates Chinese people, and that's why you said that. So we're not going to back you on that at all. Also, these companies do this because it's profitable. What you're talking about is that would work, I think, socially, but you're asking companies to go, here's the way that you make a bunch of profits. Let's stop doing that. And I want all of you to agree to make a lot less money around the planet, all of you rich people. I'm not familiar with billionaires saying, let me sign a deal so that I make less money in the future than what I did in the past. I'm not trying to be facetious. I'm just saying, when we talk about we're going to get everybody together to do what's right, that means people with money will be losing money, and they won't be able to tell their stockholders, we're going to make less next year than we did in the future. By law, most corporations have to increase the profit for their stockholders. Like that's so we'd have to get them convinced to do something that's not in their financial interest. And we'd have to do it on a global scale in China and here in America. And we'd have to get all these billionaires to do it. And we'd have to get liberal America to realize that Trump was actually correct when he said the trade rules need to be rewritten instead of just trashing him as an idiot and crazy for saying that. Is that fair?
Or Bernie Sanders. Bernie Sanders also in 2016 talked about rewriting global trade rules.
Yes,
it wasn't
right.
Just Trump.
Right.
And Trump's position tends to be more unilateral. He tends to say, let's tariff countries and punish them and force them instead of cooperating multilaterally. So
Bernie Sanders also made the same message, and the Democratic Party crushed his campaign.
Yes.
They made sure that he was not able to get the vote in Nevada by pushing his followers out of the way. That's on video. And then they had to admit in a federal court in Florida that they in fact lied to the entire Democratic Party base, and that they had the right to do that they didn't have to do what the voters want. They could do whatever they want, tell people whatever they want, and pick whoever they want. They had to admit that in the federal court. And they said in 2016, Debbie Wasserman Schultz said that. So that's not good on the Democrats. I mean, Bernie Sanders made this message, and they literally went against democracy to make sure he was destroyed, and did things that you see in a Central African country. And then Trump said the same thing, and they go, well, you're a horrible racist for saying it. So if Bernie's on the left and he does this and they destroy him, and the Democratic Party did that, and Trump's on the right and he does this and they paint him as a horrible monster and half the country thinks he's Hitler, who then is the leader that's going to convince us to rewrite these trade rules?
Well, I think we have to, instead of looking for a leader externally, we have to start organizing to try to get this done ourselves. I think the lesson of the last 10 years is that the Democratic and Republican parties are not interested in doing this. They're interested in winning elections the quickest and easiest way possible. And that doesn't require them to solve our problems. Our electoral system does not incentivize the politicians to solve our problems. So I think we have to start organizing in different kinds of ways. And that's often going to be, yes, against the interests of the billionaires and the transnational corporations, who in many cases will hire people to say things in public that will divide us up in various ways and make it hard for us to cooperate and work together. And that's where I think that sharp conflict between the college-educated professionals and the traditional workers is so important. I think more than anything else in the last 10 years, this has been the big problem in terms of trying to generate a public response to this problem. It's that in many, many cases, college-educated workers are being encouraged by more successful people to look down on people without degrees who are poorly educated who vote Republican. And conversely, people who are blue collar, who are working class, who are doing that, are being encouraged to view college educated people as their enemy, as pretentious, and to have a disdain for intellectual things. And I think that this very sharp antagonism has made it very easy for people to just keep this system going and keep it humming along. And the consequence of that is that the stress level is getting worse. The level of mental illness is getting extremely high in the country because people are so stressed out all the time.
Thank you, Professor.
Yeah.
You're right. It's a really, I have mental health issues in my family. It's a serious issue, and the depression has been growing. That's what partly worries me, is that we're seeing people are a lot more angry. I'm sure you've seen the data showing that people will not date or marry across political lines. I think it was like 12% in the past, and now it's up to like 30 or 40% now. So that's like a hard statistic of people saying, you know, they'd marry and date, and now I won't do that. Additionally, maybe you've heard of The Big Sort. It was a book, and it shows that Americans have been dividing into separate communities. So if you look at the 1992, 2012, this actually goes to 2024, NPR confirmed that. I'm just showing this so you can see it easier. 1992, these are our landslide election counties. So red equals 20 to 30% chance support for Republicans more than Democrats, AKA if you're a Democrat and you try to run in one of those red blocks, you're going to lose because they get 30% more. Blue's the opposite. You know, if you're a Republican, don't even run here. We always vote Democrats by 20 to 30% more. Most of the country was gray, 1992. By 2012, that's wiped out. 2024, the trend's even more continued. So we can look at these things and say definitively, in the 1990s, most of the country was not in a landslide locked elect district, and now that's that way. This trend is 30 years old. Can we really undo this?
Yeah, it might not be possible. One of the things that nobody wants to admit is that we might not be able to solve this. It might have progressed at this point too far for us to solve. And the thing that really concerns me is that eventually people will be so stressed out by this that they'll become willing to entertain a war with China to try to revise the global trade system unilaterally, which I think would be enormously devastating, not just to us or to people in China, but to people all over the world. I really think if we don't find a way to come together and sort this out multilaterally with China and with the European Union, with India, with other states around the world, we're on a path that doesn't go anywhere good. And I am genuinely quite concerned that we will not be able to find a way to take action in society to stop it. Our discussion, our debate isn't really dealing with any of this stuff. We're not really talking about any of these issues in a direct way. So I am very concerned about the future.
I remember the thing that caught me, because we just went through election season and they're like, what's the most important issue? It's this, it's that, and that. For me, the most important issue was that for the first time ever, there's the potential for a large trading bloc to be larger than the West and come up with an alternative currency for international trade than the dollar. And that's basically not discussed at all. That has been theorized. They've actually started to pull it off, the BRICS Union, the last couple of years. A alternative to the US dollar would cripple the American economic system and reduce us back to before the Bretton Woods conference, when we made sure everybody had to use the US dollar, we're probably looking at like the 1930s level of value of the dollar. No discussion about that at all. Hey, the dollar may not be the reserve currency anymore for the first time since World War II, and that could dramatically change everything. Purchasing power, wealth of America, its ability to project power abroad. No discussion from either party. So I agree with you. Yeah, I was like, wow, we are not talking about gigantic, pivotal economic issues that could change the life of everybody. It's abortion, or you want transgendered operations for 12-year-olds. And that's what's really important. I was like,
well, I think when other countries around the world look at what's going on in our country, they're not viewing our government as a credible negotiating partner or as a responsible actor because of the way that we are behaving internally. We don't have a lot of credibility when we try to negotiate deals. And so a lot of states are making contingency plans in the event that we start behaving even worse. And we can't be relied upon to play the leadership role that we've historically played. They're thinking ahead and they're going, what do we do if the Americans are no longer going to be able to safeguard the global economic system and make it functional? So it is very concerning. And also, it would not at all be good for these other countries to get to a point where they have to try to find a way to do it without us. A lot of these countries, China in particular, has grown enormously by cooperating with the United States, by trading with the United States. It would not be good for people in China for us to behave like that either. They have good reasons to work with us and we have good reasons to work with them. The world will become a much harder place if we don't, for everybody.
I completely agree. My understanding, though, is that it is the West that does not want to participate in the Belt and Road Initiative and the expansion of growth under the BRICS, and that we're not going to the conferences and we're not allowing negotiations with them. And we're kind of taking an antagonistic attitude towards them, especially when you hear about it in the news. I mean, the Belt and Road Initiative by China is not spoken well in American media. And yet it's a gigantic chance for economic growth equivalent to the freeway system in the 1950s. We built the freeway system in the 50s. The American economy exploded because of connectivity. Now, they built that for defense issues, but the economic impact was huge. It's the same thing. You connect everybody, all ships rise. Better goods, more jobs, etc. But we seem to be not open to that idea. If you talk about, hey, let's be part of China's Belt and Road Initiative, you will be destroyed as a politician in America. That's what I've seen. You can't talk about
we're treating it as a competition where it's about who's leading. And so it becomes the Chinese system or the American system. It becomes Cold War mentality, two separate systems. And the more we think like that, the more real that will become ultimately. If we have the view that the Chinese are completely different from us, that their systems will necessarily be completely different from ours, then we won't work on preventing that from becoming the case.
China is culturally different, but I'm from California. I've known a lot of Asian people. Chinese culture is inherently about money and prosperity. That's what they want, I think. But we are not, Americans are not very aware of the foreign world. We're not very interested in learning about the foreign world. We kind of have a perspective of the way that we view the world is the way everybody else should. We think you need democracy in Iraq. You should want it just as much as we do for you. Same thing with Afghanistan. Same thing with Libya. Same thing with Syria. We do this all the time. I don't care about your background. We're right. We know what's best for you. Have this. Oh, did you revolt and cause a civil war? Well, we're still correct. I mean, we never apologized about destroying Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, Syria, taking over Honduras, destroying Vietnam, etc. We don't do that. I think Winston Churchill said it best. Count on the Americans to do the right thing always after they've tried everything else. That's a quote from him.
Yeah. And one of the things that really concerns me lately is the tendency for foreign policy issues to be taken up as culture war issues by our media.
Yeah.
People putting flags in the profiles and side taking in wars, rooting for sides to win rather than looking for ways to make peace. This is, I think, one of the things that's gotten significantly worse about American political culture in just the last few years. 10, 20, 30 years ago, people would not have talked about these wars in the ways that they're now talking about them. It's gotten significantly worse. And it's because content creators have found that they can get clicks and make money by talking about conflicts in this way.
Truly sad. I remember when Facebook, to support the Ukraine war, said that they were going to remove some of their content guidelines and that people could actually start using racial and ethnic slurs against the Russians if you wanted, while making a post in support of Ukraine. So they literally pulled down their race guidelines in order to back the Ukraine war. I'm not making that up. That was public news. They admitted that. I found that disgusting since I'm a minority. I thought, you shouldn't be allowing racist language for anybody, but they did. Jon Stewart famously took a picture with a Ukrainian soldier who had the black sun emblem on his arm. Nobody said anything. That terrified me as a minority. The Azov battalion was listed by the U.S. State Department as quote unquote the white ISIS. I'm not making that up. You can look up U.S. State Department Azov battalion. They said that about 2015. And now the Biden administration literally said we're giving weapons to this group. That's a fact. That's not my interpretation. They said that in the last 2 months. So as a non-Caucasian person, that terrifies the hell out of me. But unfortunately, like you said, we pick a side. They're the good guys. Everybody's got to be the bad guys, right? There can be nothing reasonable about the opposition. They have to be all bad. What happens if ideas from this sitting member of Congress begin to be seen as a solution? You were talking about, there isn't a division between democracy or communism. We're really talking about people generally agree on the system of government, but we're talking about international trade blocks. What if we don't fix the economic issues? What if we can't turn back the clock? Like Ross Perot warned everybody in America this was going to happen, and they said, you're crazy, right? Turns out he was true. Now you have Marjorie Taylor Greene saying, maybe we split between red and blue. And that's the solution. And I'm going to ask you, hold your answer. I'm going to ask you, I'm betting you're not going to say that's going to fix everything economically. But as you know, with politics, it's about perception and not facts. Will people see this picture and then think she's got the right solution?
Well, I think that the electoral map is at this point very urban versus rural. If you were to look at districts that have a population density greater than a particular amount, you would find all of those are Democrat voting districts. And conversely, below a certain level of population density, all of those districts are Republican districts.
Sure.
You can't really divide a country in terms of urban versus rural. And I think that that is the thing that's not really captured by a lot of the national divorce stuff. It's really a cities versus rural areas, a college educated versus not. Those are really the demographic divisions that are at the heart of the division politically. So I don't see how you could do that by land, because it's not really a land-based division. The language of red states and blue states, which comes out of the Electoral College, can be suggestive of that, but I don't think it corresponds with the actual division. Someone like Marjorie Taylor Greene comes from a very gerrymandered, very bizarre district that is quite unusual versus the rest of the country. And the same is true of, say, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. There are a lot of members of Congress in the House who come from very unusual districts. The strategy for winning elections in those districts is very different from the strategy that a national candidate, or even a candidate looking to represent a broad swathe of states, say the red states or the blue states, would have to use. So I think that generally members of Congress who come from gerrymandered seats, the things that they say should be taken with a grain of salt, because they're really coming from very unusual, not that the people who live in their districts are necessarily unusual, but because of the way the district's borders have been drawn, they are not having to represent people who in many cases live just a few blocks away from the people that they are representing.
Sure.
So it produces very unusual language. I would try not to get too worked up about that stuff, because I do think that that is very unrepresentative of general feeling in the country.
So when she says people are interested in political division, she's incorrect. That's just not a popular idea.
It's true in her district. She's interested in political division because she comes from a very unusual district where talking that way is politically effective.
Okay.
But the reason that so often it's Marjorie Taylor Greene who's brought up as the example of that, or Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez by the other side,
right,
is that there are only a handful of districts that are really quite that unusual in the House, to the point where that kind of politics is the most effective kind of politics.
Okay.
And it's something that I think has been a major problem for both the left and the right, is that they've been attached to these figures who come from these very gerrymandered seats. And then this prevents them from developing electoral strategies that are more competitive nationally and limits their ability to expand as movements.
Fair enough. Fair enough. All right, let me show you something real quick, if I may. There are independence movements in New Hampshire. They actually got it on the ballot there. Texas got it into the Republican state convention. There's Vermont. I know Alaska and California. Those movements seem to have some traction, and they're saying, well, it's not working, and that's not Marjorie Taylor Greene. That's people in those areas. New Hampshire, Texas, Oregon, Alaska, California. I mean, guaranteed. In California, we're talking about CalExit again. So that's just straight up. One of the things I found, though, is that when we look at, you're right, most states are purple like Ohio, but not every state. So on the far left is Illinois. It's pretty much all red except for the Chicago area. The next to it is Oregon, 3/4 red except for the blue in the top left corner. When we look at Texas, the border's blue, and then you have 3 small dots. 85% of the landmass is red. And finally, when we look at Georgia, the big blue dot is Atlanta, and then I think there's a blue strip going across, but other sections of red. Certainly looking at Oregon and Illinois, maybe Texas, it would be possible to split liberal from conservative and have 2 cohesive wholes. Obviously, that's not the case in every state, but would it be fair to say that in some states that's possible?
Well, looking at those maps, so much of the economic activity in these states is driven by the blue cities in them.
Sure.
That's where a lot of the growth has been. I think you would
Right.
have a difficult time having a viable state on the red territory if you actually had a hard border of the kind that nation states tend to have between the red and the blue. It would cause a lot of
Sure.
problems practically in people's lives to have a hard border in those cases. Even where you can draw one, in practice, so much of the activity of Illinois is about interactions between Chicago and that red hinterland. That
Right.
it would be very economically disruptive. And one of the things that I have noticed is that there are a lot of people who are interested in certain policies until the cost of living effects of those policies are experienced. And then at that point, they become very critical of the government that they associate with the cost of living increase. And a lot of parties, especially in Europe during the Euro crisis, ran on separatism, and then when pushed up against it, had to reconsider that because of the economic costs that that would have entailed. I'm thinking specifically of Syriza in Greece here as I say this. A country that was being very badly treated, had many reasons to want to revise European arrangements or to potentially even get out of the European Union, but did not have a large enough economic base
Right.
to be able to do that without enormous hardship. And I think at this stage in the United States, the red parts of the country and the blue parts of the country are too economically interdependent.
Okay. So maybe you could split some states, but economically, the red state part would lose the moment they leave. And so the conservatives would realize that. And then realistically, when push came to shove, choose to not go with national division. Is that a fair summary?
Yeah, and it would also be the case that the blue cities would suffer greatly losing those hinterlands. A lot of the goods and services that are distributed in the cities, the consumption that goes on in those cities, a lot of that stuff is made in the hinterland and comes from the hinterland. So it goes both ways. I think in both cases, there would be an enormous reduction in the size of the economy in both red and blue blocks if that happened, and that ultimately is the reason it will not occur.
What if people say, I'm so disgusted by this other side, I don't care if we lose economically? I've literally seen people in Oregon, Texas, New Hampshire, Alaska, Florida, and Vermont say that. Now, like you said, it's easy to say one thing versus actual decision time and dealing with the consequences of your decision. But we have seen humans go for it when perhaps the path forward wasn't clear. Going back to Greece, they famously pushed back against Europe. I remember the prime minister went to a meeting, told them no, and then went on television and said they threatened to kill me, right? And then that guy got pushed out of office, but he was still around. So they pushed back when it was really stupid. We also had the defund the police movement here. 22 cities took that idea up and did it for about a year. It resulted in 22 cities on fire. I believe you heard about the CHOP in Portland, multiple deaths, young men executed in the streets. 22 cities went for it for a year before they figured it out. Greece went for it for a year before they figured it out. We also have people saying, if we have to have a trade war with China and we'll have some economic hardships, then that's okay too. You can also look at the Confederacy. They were famously going to get taken down a notch economically, and they said, we prefer independence. A lot of independent movements. I think there's 200 countries around the world. Most of them were only focused about being independent, and the economics was like, we'll deal with it as it comes. Can we be sure that when two groups of people really hate each other, and I'm talking about there's another January 6th and another January 6th, and even though it's not rational, and even though it's based upon economics, they've been hearing, like you said, politicians talking, they're the bad guys, they're the bad guys, they're the bad guys. See, these immigrants killed this girl. See, they kill you. And this goes on for a few more years. Are we sure that people can't be so emotionally whipped up that maybe they're not thinking rationally about economics, as we've seen in places before in history?
Well, at that point, I think it would elevate into a discussion about security rather than economics, right? When a country like Greece thinks about pulling out of the EU, it knows that it can remain a member of NATO even if it's outside of the European Union. So it
Yeah,
has security guarantees,
yeah,
even if it chooses to economically pay that price. In the
yeah.
case of the United States, the last time that secession was tried, it led to a major war in which there was extreme violence. And that occurred at a time when the military of the country was mainly people with rifles, right? Those rifles that the soldiers had were not very different from the rifles that an ordinary person might have in their house.
Sure.
So it's easy enough for people to think, well, if we all get together with our rifles, we might be able to defeat an army that would come that would be armed with roughly the same kinds of weapons. One of the lessons of the world wars that I do think people have internalized is that at this point, there is a kind of industrialized military machine that exists, that the federal government possesses, that completely dwarfs anything that the states or private individuals, however organized, are going to be able to contend with, that there is a capacity for force on the part of the federal government, particularly in the United States, that is difficult for people to fathom and probably is more than can be imagined by an ordinary person. And I think that if we really were to start getting into that kind of talk of a state actually attempting to secede, I think what we would find is that the state government would not control military forces adequate to actually do that.
Fair enough. Yeah, and then that's if you go the violent route. What if people peaceably agree to separate like they did with the Soviet Union? There was just a simple vote between 4 or 5 countries, and they said, "That's it, we're out." And that was one of the most peaceful separations. I'm concerned that maybe people get to the point where they just don't like each other, and that's agreed. But and I don't support violence, but I do want to point out I get what you're saying. President Joseph Robinette Biden and Eric Swalwell both made the comments to red state supporters that if you wanted to leave, we got the nukes, is what they said. We got the nukes, meaning we'll drop a nuclear bomb on you. I found that not good for saying how we're all Americans, but Eric Swalwell and Joseph Robinette Biden both said that to red state people. The question I have, though, is that there was a place called Anbar Province in Iraq, guys with sandals, AK-47s, and RPGs. They defeated the United States Marine Corps. That's why we had to do the Iraqi Anbar Awakening, where they actually worked with Sunni tribesmen that were previously shooting and killing American Marines. That was the only way that they could actually turn that. That's a fact. Then there's the country of Afghanistan. Same thing, sandals, AK-47s. They defeated the U.S. without an air force, armor, etc. Then we can look at Vietnam. Same thing, sandals, AK-47s, RPGs. No real air force to fight back, no real armor defense, and that's 3 examples. So I hope we don't go there, but there are examples where the U.S. military was defeated. They couldn't
Yeah,
retrieve
I
their
would draw a
goal.
distinction. In those cases, the US military was deployed to foreign territory in
Sure,
wars that were not necessary
sure,
to win. So, to use Vietnam as an example, the Johnson and Nixon administrations decided not to send US ground troops into North Vietnam because they
sure,
believed that if they did that, China would be drawn into the war as had happened in the Korean case,
sure.
and that would produce a much larger kind of conflict. There was also a lack of willingness in the cases of Afghanistan and Iraq to commit enormously brutal, acts of genocide, effectively, just enormously violent acts to
Okay.
pacify territory, because there was not really a need for the federal government to prevail ultimately in those parts of the world. Certainly not one that would be worth the costs in terms of the U.S. image, in terms of public opinion at home, of committing those kinds of extraordinarily violent, destructive acts. Civil wars tend to bring out the absolute worst features of states. They tend to cause states to show their very most ruthless and nasty and cruel sides. They tend to produce a level of violence that is very, very difficult for us to fathom. I would not want to compare a possible civil war in the United States to any war which has yet happened in human history. I think it would be much more devastating than any conflict that has occurred. I think that we're seeing in the case of the Soviet Union, I think some people drew the wrong lessons from that because Mikhail Gorbachev chose not to fight that conflict. There is a perception that perhaps the United States would, of its own accord, peaceably dissolve in a situation like that. I don't think that's the case in the case of the United States. In the Soviet Union, there was very explicitly an effort to frame each of the SSRs as a separate nation. That's not really the language that's been deployed in the United States. And I also don't think it's how Americans experience life in this country. People don't feel that they're part of that their state is their nation in the way that, say, a Ukrainian living in Ukraine SSR might have felt. And we're also seeing that the violence of the breakup of the Soviet Union is not finished. The current conflict in Ukraine is itself an iteration of that violence, a very nasty and bloody iteration with trench warfare, heavy artillery, enormous numbers of infantry being killed, hundreds of thousands of people. This is the kind of scale on which I think that kind of breakup would, I think that's what it would result in. And it would be worse because the violent capabilities of the United States far dwarf that of the Russian Federation.
So you're saying that if there was a civil war in America, they'd go all out, maybe to genocidal levels, and they actually put on some soft gloves when they were fighting in Iraq and Vietnam and Afghanistan and didn't go as hardcore as they could have. Is that
yes,
fair?
Those were limited wars.
Okay.
And there were significant movements in each of those cases within the administrations or within the military-industrial complex that argued for widening those wars or deepening them. In isolated cases, certain things were tried that were major expansions, like, for instance, a decision by the Nixon administration to bomb Cambodia and Laos, right? But even in that case, the Nixon administration's attitude was that this was short of an invasion of North Vietnam, that this was something they could do instead of that would be less intense than that.
Sure.
And of course, the effect of those bombing runs was to destroy the Cambodian state, leading to the Khmer Rouge and the destruction of an enormous number of people as the Khmer Rouge attempted to liquidate the cities of Cambodia.
Sure.
The things that can be unleashed are very, very difficult for us to fathom. We should be extremely careful about anything which might unleash any of that. It's been so long since we in the United States have been part of that kind of war that it is very easy, I think, for us to forget that it wouldn't just be as bad as World War I or World War II if we did that kind of thing again. It would be worse.
Fair point. I just have to point out, got a lot of Vietnam vets, and that's the same thing they said. We could have won Nam if we really wanted to. I'll point out a lot of historians disagree with that. I'll also point out that in Afghanistan, the Soviet Union did invade. They did go scorched earth, and they were still defeated. That happened before we got there. They were wiping out entire cities. Didn't care. No reservations for human cost of life, and they still lost.
Well, I don't necessarily think we could have won in Vietnam, because I think the People's Republic of China would have come into that conflict. And I do think it would have escalated and become enormously devastating.
I agree. I don't think we could have. But we're looking at, if the Civil War happens in America, we're looking at America drops nukes on American cities. They're willing to commit these massive level of atrocities that we wouldn't do in a foreign country, simply because it's a super existential threat. Is that a fair summary?
Well, and even if it were not nuclear weapons, there's a lot of things that were not done in those limited wars that could be done in the United States. And there is probably military technology that we are not privy to that exists that we don't even know about, that we would only learn about if something like that were to get
sure
off.
Absolutely. Is it possible that people would decide they just don't want to be with each other, like a divorce, and they would come to Congress and say, hey, we don't want to shoot anybody? Marjorie Taylor Greene has said that a civil war is coming. I'm not asking you to endorse that, but she and some of her supporters have said things are getting worse. They're continuing to get worse. We don't see a solution. We want to stop a civil war. And so we think peaceably coming together and negotiating divorce might be a way to do that. If under that theoretical scenario, you had 55% of Americans saying it's okay if you wanted to go, versus us shooting at each other. Would that work? Could you possibly have a peaceful separation if everybody agreed to vote, negotiate, no guns? Or is that just off the table. It's just too unworkable given the complexities and the interlinkages between the federal government and the various states, like you were pointing out earlier.
Well, if you suppose as a premise that the overwhelming majority, or at least a large majority of people want something, it's possible if they really want it for them to get it, almost no matter what it is. The question is, would they be willing to actually endure the costs of it when those costs become clear to them after the fact? So, for instance, you might all come together and say, we'd like to do something different. But then when you're paying the economic costs, might you go, hey, I bet they have a lot of wealth in that city, which is now technically on the other side of the border. I bet there's a lot of good stuff over there. And maybe we should go over there and take some of it. And then maybe the people over there might defend the stuff that's there. And now, because you have a national border, you have a basis for escalating this far beyond the level to which you otherwise would have done.
Right.
I think it could very easily get out of hand, even if initially a very large number of people are interested in doing it peaceably. We've seen this in cases where there have been partitions in countries like India during decolonization, where large numbers of people were, because you always have a significant amount of population movement, even if you have a case where it's 75% Democrat in one place, 75% Republican in another place. 25% of the US population is millions of people having to relocate. Violence can break out during that relocation. And in the case of India and Pakistan, that's the case in which we've come the closest to nuclear use since World War II.
That's fair with their division. I will point out, a lot of people point out the India-Pakistan partition and people moving back and forths and the amount of deaths that occurred as an example of how you can't do that. I always push back by saying they literally did no preparation. The British said they would provide no protection. There was nobody organizing anything, no protection, no safe routes. And they said, you need to do it like this fast. That, of course. Of course, that's never brought up, that they could have organized it. They could have expanded it over a couple of years. They could have provided protection, and the British could have provided corridors. They did none of those things.
Well, another case that occurred with a greater level of organization would be, say, the breakup of Sudan, which has produced yet another round of fighting. They thought that a partition there would be effective at ending the conflict, but it hasn't been. I respect it. I think this is your thing. This is what you think of as the solution, right? You have some level of involvement in CalExit.
I'm trying to, I do, but this interview series isn't about that. I'm trying to find the answers. And when I interviewed 200 professors on political science, none of them agreed on what the problem for political division was. There's schools of thought, right? It's social media, it's economics, like you said, it's generational divides between the boomers and the new people. It's we need to remove primaries. We need to get rid of independence. And what I found was that even within each thought, you had different schools of thought on the solution. So if you agree social media is the solution, there'd be 4 or 5 different ways on how to fix that. What got me was that there didn't seem to be a consensus amongst all 200 professors when looking at the West Coast, East Coast, South, Midwest, Northwest, etc. Even some from England who were Americans studying it here. There was no general consensus. It was a series of 5 to 12 theories on which one, and then theories within those. One of the things that scared the hell out of me was that there were actual professors saying we might be approaching a civil war, and they were having data. You can dismiss that, that's fine. But one of them was Robert Putnam. He's famous. Okay, and then there was another guy out of USC who did this with hard data. So there's like 4 or 5 people with hard data. That's a little bit scary. So I said, well, maybe that doesn't happen. And they go, okay. And I go, tell me how, and I did the magic wand thing. And go, professor, tell me how we fix this. Tell me how we fix this. You have your solution, right, that you're suggesting with your academic reports. Let's say you could automatically make that happen. Do you believe that if we did everything you suggested, America would snap back into place? 5 out of 200 said that. About 195 out of 200 said this phrase. I'll do it for you. I hope. I'm a lay person. I'm not in academia. I'm not a professor. I haven't spent my life studying political science. And then I talked to 200 people that did, and what I noticed was the best they had was, I hope. I hope we fix this. I hope America gets better. You guys are the experts with the solutions and the most knowledge. And 95% of you are saying, I hope. That terrified the hell out of me. So I moved to, maybe this idea that this union's going to last is 95% of them. I was expecting to hear, here's the solution. I know it will work. We just need to try this. Is that? That's not what most of them said. And these are the experts. I find when I tell my friends and family that, their face goes white. They're scared. You're the experts. You're supposed to save us, right? And you guys aren't sure, don't have an agreed upon solution. And most of you go, gee, I hope my solution works. I hope. That is not reassuring to average Americans. And it's not reassuring to a quasi-academic like myself. And so I'm looking at this. And the other thing I found out when I talked to the professors, I go, tell me which one of you predicted January 6th. Not one. Not one. 200 experts in the field, not one predicted January 6th. So I'm going, okay, so you didn't predict January 6th, and you hope we have a solution. Tell me, how do we prevent January 6th, part 2, part 3, part 4, part 5? Tell me that your solution can definitely be implemented before a second January 6th, a third one. None of them would commit to that, not one. They would say, well, I hope it works. And, and if this person votes and Senate comes in and we get this together, then we could definitely do that. I go, I'm looking for a guaranteed yes answer. Here's how we save the country. Not one. I hope, maybe, but they all had to admit the polarization. And even if you had a solution, are you really going to get through Congress? And so when I saw a lack of consensus, and I saw some people like Putnam saying civil war, and I saw all of them saying, I hope, and none of them had resolutions, and none of them could say, I'm sure this will work out, and I'm sure everything's going to be great. Maybe 5 out of 200 said, it's fine. There's nothing to worry about. We've had tough times. We'll get past this. But the rest of them were like, I didn't see January 6th. And I go, how do you know there's not going to be a second one? They go, I don't. I can't predict that. I didn't predict the first one. And I go, tell me that America's state, and they go, well, but we got over January 6th. Okay. Tell me that America can survive January 6th, part 2, part 3, part 4, and part 5, and be emotionally cool and balanced about it. People go through that 5 times, and I need you to predict that we're going to be rational people at the other end. Nobody would do that. So I've had to expand my mind to the universe of possibilities because the experts could not predict January 6th, which terrified the hell out of me. I remember watching that at home with my mom. We were cleaning the house. We literally had trash cans in our hand, and we just dropped them and stared at the screen for 30 minutes because we could not believe people were storming the Capitol since the first time since 1812. Whether or not that was a real serious attempt or going to go anywhere, that terrified the hell out of this country. Terrified this country. How do we know that people can go through 5 more terrifying experiences and think rationally and calm and hey, we're all Americans, we can come together, especially when Joe Biden says half you guys are garbage right before the election? That really tapped into a hard sentiment when Hillary Clinton said they're all deplorables. I got to tell you, people were pissed off like that. Or on Trump's side, when they say Puerto Rico's a garbage island of garbage, that's racist. So these remarks are still going on, and I'm not seeing reassurance from the experts. What I'm seeing is, I don't know, we have a bunch of theories, boy, we hope. Well, that tells me I need to keep my bets open to every possibility. We can't be sure. I'm just not seeing the reassurance from the people that I expected to. I was expecting people to say, I'm an expert. I've studied this for decades. I'm an American. I'm 50 or 60 years old. I lived through the 60s. I know for a fact as an expert that my solution will work if we can just get it through and it'll fix it. And I basically couldn't find that anywhere.
Yeah, here's what I'll give you. Here's what I'll give you. The most I can give you is that while we do not agree on the nature of the problem, we do not agree on what to do, we have sharp disagreements about anything positive, we are all scared of the same thing, which is the loss of democracy, the loss of civil order. Ultimately, to have real political violence, somebody has to be willing to pick up a gun and and run at somebody else and run through hails of bullets, if we're all scared of that, if we're all terrified of that, if we share that fear, even though we don't get along, that fear can keep us together. And this would be the political theory of Thomas Hobbes, where you have a fractious multitude that doesn't agree on anything,
Right.
apart from the fact that it doesn't want to die. And it knows that if it opens the Pandora's box, that there will be a lot of death. And I think that is still the thing ultimately that keeps people together in states like the United States, especially now. I think more people think like Hobbes than did when Hobbes was writing. Because of the world wars, because of what happened in the 20th century in terms of the fate of state communism, the fate of fascism, I think a lot of people are not expecting the political system to ultimately deliver for them, but they don't want to be hurt. They don't want their family and friends hurt. And that is the thing that ultimately still unites people. Even amidst all their disagreement, people do not want to die, and they are scared of war, scared of what this country could become. We all have a vague understanding that the American federal state has enormous levels of violent capacity that we only are dimly aware of, that we don't fully understand. We do not want to get caught up in that. We do not want World War III. People in the 50s and 60s said, of course, the Cold War between the Soviet Union and the United States will have to become hot. Sooner or later, these two states will have to go to war with each other. And won't there be nuclear use? Yeah. But the people running both states had familiarity and knowledge of World War II. Yeah. They knew what would happen if they did actually start to pull triggers and press buttons. And for that reason, even though they hated each other, at the level of the world system, the Soviet bloc and the American bloc absolutely hated each other, far more than we hate each other today. They were not willing to pull those triggers and push those buttons, except in limited circumstances in developing countries where they fought these proxy wars.
Absolutely.
So that would be my case. I think there will be instances where some people commit terrorist acts and some people do things that are unreasonable, but I think ultimately most of us do not want to die, and that still unites us.
I hope so. I'm against violence. Violence in politics is bad. When January 6th happened, I'm in California, right? And I'm amongst liberals. And I've lived here, I'm 46, I've lived here for years. We're the peaceniks. We fought against the Vietnam War. We protested against the Iraq War. I had people in the Bay Area and in Los Angeles who don't know each other call me and say, why didn't we line those 300 Republicans up on the stages of the Capitol and gun them down live on TV? I'm not saying that as hyperbole. I'm saying that as people who've never said that to me before in their life, that day said that. Two different people didn't know each other. And I'm thinking, wow, you guys don't know each other. And this is two different people. It's scaring the hell out of me with your rhetoric. Why don't we gun down 300 people on TV to let them know? And then I just saw Trump get elected. And now I'm hearing from Californians, if he gets shot, it wouldn't be the worst thing.
Yeah, one of the things that's happened is that because people can't actually imagine doing these violent acts, participating in them, they use more inflammatory rhetoric in part to paper over what they're not willing to do. People are willing to say worse things in part because they're not willing to act. And I think one of the symptoms of the likelihood of inaction is the intensity of the rhetoric. Part of why they can be so intense is that they're not going to translate that rhetoric into action. They know it. They think you know it when they say it to you. Very, very few of these people who talk this way could ever imagine picking up a gun and taking a shot at any of those people.
I agree.
But they enjoy saying it in part because saying it enables them to not do it. It's in part, we have a flood of violent video games in our society where people pretend that they are shooting at people in games. And everybody who has ever played a first-person shooter knows that no matter how good you are at the first-person shooter, eventually you die in the game. Right. Eventually somebody kills you. You can't be so good at the game that you are never killed. Modern warfare is like that. Modern warfare doesn't reward skill. Modern warfare is luck of the draw.
Yeah. I hear you. Am I wrong to be surprised that people I've known for decades use that language for the first time I've ever known them? I mean, I've never heard that, and then all of a sudden, I'm hearing this. Is it totally wrong to be at least somewhat alarmed by that?
I don't think it's wrong to be surprised or upset. I think we're all undergoing a lot of stress, and we're all saying things that often we really don't mean. And if we played it back on a tape recorder a week later uh, to ourselves, we would go, "Ooh, should I really have said that? Do I really mean that? If that was in front of a judge, would I be happy at the way I look? If that was in front of God, would I be happy with the way I look? Depending on your religious belief or lack thereof." I think a lot of people are saying a lot of things that they don't mean. And I think there's a lot of insincerity in our politics that comes from this shared understanding that we have that we can't actually escalate it. And we're constantly being ironic. There's all these memes and all this very, very insincere political rhetoric, in part because there is a shared understanding that we can't actually litigate it with force.
So should liberals not be as concerned by some of the crazy things that Trump says then? I mean, going by this
Yes.
philosophy, he's just saying
Yes.
stuff.
In fact, being concerned about the things people are saying escalates it. The fear is the thing that is really the danger. Like FDR said in the 30s, that the main thing we have to fear is fear itself, fear of other people and the threat that we think that they pose.
Yeah.
That's the thing that can ultimately propel us to shoot somebody, is that we think that if we don't shoot them, they'll shoot us. Our belief that they might shoot us is the thing which ultimately motivates us to shoot them.
Right. Right.
So the fear itself is the problem. And in many cases, if we can listen to the things people say and not get so terrified and go, well, they're saying it in part because they're not doing it, it makes it easier for us to not shoot them. Because once we start shooting people because we're scared, they're going to shoot us back. The more
absolutely.
you shoot, the more shooting happens.
And I'm against violence. I'm a peacenik. I've gone to the anti-war protest. Violence has no place in it. But I was expecting a lot more solutions than what I found, and resolution, and I didn't find it. So when
the modern state is not a solution, it's just a hodgepodge way of preventing us from killing each other. The modern state was created in response to religious conflict. It was created in response to very sharp class conflict. It is a continuously thrown together way of avoiding an enormous catastrophe.
Sure. But at the same time, the rhetoric's increasing. I mean, Hillary said they're deplorables. Now we're moving on to Trump saying there's the enemy within. I'm going to be a dictator on day one. I'm going to round up those people and use lawfare against the ones that use. And the media is reporting it. So it sounds like what you're saying is the media reporting that isn't helping the situation. We should recognize that he's just speaking hyperbolically, and you shouldn't treat it as that serious a threat, because it's not the actual real threat. It's the emotion of fear, I think, is what you're saying, is what's going to drive people to do stupid things, not the actual problem existing, the perception of fear.
And it's also your reaction to it that makes it good political rhetoric for him. The fact that you get upset when he says that, and then you post upset things on social media, or if not you, other people in your position, right? That's what the supporters of Trump, when he says that, that's what they enjoy. They enjoy seeing you being upset and having a meltdown. And it goes the other way as well, right? When Biden says that they're garbage, right? The Democrats enjoy seeing the Trump supporters get upset about that. This dunking on people, it produces a joy in stressed out, very unhappy people. And that's really what it's about. When they say these things, they're trying to produce joy in their own supporters. They're trying to produce a cathartic moment. But it's not actually a threat of violence, because it's toothless. They're cowards. They won't actually do it. And both sides are cowards who won't actually do it. They don't actually mean the things that they're saying. They just want that catharsis. That catharsis motivates people to vote. The idea, a lot of Republicans, their motivation to vote is to see liberals upset.
Right.
It's the liberal tears. So the more upsetting, it's like when you're in a family, sometimes in families, people will say things just to upset each other.
Sure.
Not because they mean them, but because they're upset.
Sure.
And there are many kinds of families where, nobody would ever actually hit each other. but they would say the most awful things imaginable.
Fair enough. But going back to your point that we're looking at, there isn't that much real division. It's the perception. We're stressed out because the economy isn't working for us like it used to. And so we're dealing with those issues. But when we were talking about can we fix that, it's a big ask. We're going to have a big negotiation and a lot of people with money willing to lose that money or being pushed back. If we can't fix the economy and we don't change the doom spiral where media is rewarded by having sensationalist politicians and getting views, how do we know that this doesn't get worse?
So one possibility, if we don't fix the economy, what will happen is that eventually the people who experienced directly or indirectly the post-war boom and the conditions of the 50s and 60s, these people will die off. They will age out and die off, and their children will also age out and die off. And what we will start to see is generations of Americans who have lower expectations for their lives. And I think we're already seeing this in the Zoomer generation. I think the millennial generation was the last great expectations generation that believed that it would enjoy a high standard of living on the basis of working hard and doing what it's told. The next generation is not going to have the same level of expectation because it's never going to have any familiarity with that kind of circumstance. It's never going to have any familiarity with the American dream, and so it's not going to expect it.
Am I wrong for feeling incredibly depressed by hearing that? This sounds. Oh, damn, he froze. Let me close a couple windows.
I think that is the really difficult question. The really difficult question is, what's better, a world where everybody gives up on the American dream or civil war?
I would prefer neither one.
Then we have to do something to prevent it from getting to that stage. We have to take some kind of action. Otherwise that will become the choice.
I'm just worried because Citizens United was done, I think, during Obama. That massively helped the corporations against the people. It's been over a decade. They haven't been able to undo that. And when I talk to professors about getting an amendment passed or some serious legislation in Congress, most of them don't have hope. And that's including the ones that consult for Congress. They're like, we basically can't pass legislation on anything. That's why we do the omnibus bills, where it's a giant funding bill and then everybody shoves their wants in there. That's been increasing. And you can chart it like going like this. And it kind of maps with congressional productivity going down at the same time. One of the theories.
If you ask me what's most likely, I would say it's everybody giving up.
Okay, let me ask you one last. Thank you for being here. Thank you for being honest. Thanks for answering the questions. Thanks for being willing to go into theoretical land. I know a lot of professors are not willing to do that because you're training, and I deeply respect that. You have to stick to the facts and the data, and I appreciate that. But this series is so that the public can have some idea about what the top people who know the best are thinking, and then they can make up their own mind. So I really appreciate you being willing to weave and bob a little bit. It
helps that I'm a theorist rather than an empirical social scientist.
Okay. So we're trying. I don't want to dumb down the material, but I want to make sure that we're getting the public what they want, and they need to hear: is an apple better than an orange? Then, well, an apple's technically this kind of fruit. That doesn't help them. Last question, if I may. Some professors said, we're not going to go to civil war, Mark. That's crazy. And we're not going to, have another January 6th. That's crazy, man. Come on. It wasn't even really serious. I've heard that before. What's going to happen is we're going to degrade to a quote, Brazil level quality of government and stay there for the next 30 to 40 years. Thoughts, feelings?
Well, I don't know. I don't know if I would use the comparison with Brazil. I don't want to be disparaging to Brazil. I do think that it's getting worse. I do think the quality of our education system is deteriorating. And I think that probably the quality of our governance is going to fall unless something is done while there are still generations that are alive that remember the post-war boom, that can reinvent some possibility of the American dream, not return to the 50s and 60s, but reinvent in a different way appropriate to our own situation and time,
Thank
the
you.
conditions of possibility for people. Yeah, if we can't do that, then I do think that future generations will be born in worse circumstances. The quality of governance, the quality of the discussion will be lower. But we're still here. We're still alive. We still understand that there is a dream that people are supposed to get, that they're not getting. And as long as we still have that, I'm only 32. There's still a lot of time where there will be some of us alive who know that there's a dream that we're supposed to get, and we can try to find a way. And there's still people around who remember the world wars, who fought in the world wars. Not very many, but a few. There's still a memory of that, and that helps us to avoid, the really worst case scenarios.
Yeah. It's a side topic, but I'm worried that the number of people from World War II are dying off because some of the wars America's getting into seem to aggravate the chance for a nuclear conflict. And I've seen the men who created the doomsday clock for, time to midnight. Some of them have been writing articles going, oh my God, you guys are pushing this closer than we did in the Cold War. Now, they're not really getting in the mainstream media, but it's there. Scary times. Last thing, you already kind of answered this. This is a chart. It came out from the Sabato Cristobal Center for Politics, University of Virginia. I'm sorry. Let me see if I can get a better copy here. Yeah, here we go. I'll blow this up real quick. 1 second. And you basically already answered this, but this is a question that I ask everybody, and so I usually show this poll, and so for the audience, basically what it's showing is the resentment that the two sides have towards each other. This isn't about facts; it's about perception. And here we go. So I have come to view elected officials from the opposition party as presenting a clear and present danger to American democracy. Percentage who least somewhat agree to strongly agree. 80% of Biden voters somewhat agree, 51% strongly agree, 57% of Trump voters strongly agree, 84% of Trump voters somewhat agree. So, I mean, that's not good. That's, majorities of both sides saying, I view the opposite as a clear and present danger to American society, which is the phrasing that we would use to talk about ISIS or a Russian nuclear attack. Obviously not based upon facts, but not good. Is that fair, Professor?
Oh, yes, certainly not good that people would use that language. Certainly not good that people would agree with that kind of statement, for sure.
Okay. Is there anything that I didn't ask you? Is there any solution that you had? Is there some insight into political division that we didn't get to that you feel people should hear?
Well, what I would just emphasize is that I think that both of those groups that we just talked about value democracy, right? They both think that democracy is a good thing. They just think the other side is a threat to democracy. So they really agree. It's just that they have a perception that the other side threatens the thing that they care about. But actually underneath that, they have a commitment to the same thing, which is democracy. They just don't necessarily agree on how to understand that as a value, how to instantiate it politically. Even amidst the sharpest disagreement, you are not seeing people saying, I want communism, I want fascism,
No.
You're not seeing that. We don't have Maoists, we don't have Hitlerians. No. That's not what this is.
No.
And because it's not that, there's still a possibility here, because all of these people want democracy to continue. They do not want to fight a conflict to try to impose some other kind of regime.
I typically ask people their last thought. So you're not me, you're a third-party person watching this interview. They watch it a week from now and they go, wow, I learned a lot. unique perspectives. I didn't realize the economy and the history economy was so tied to how we view each other emotionally. But there was a lot of concepts, and I struggled to remember them all. But there was this one thing that the professor said while speaking about political polarization. It's 5 days later after I watched that video. And while I struggle to remember everything, I can't get this one thought that the professor said out of my head. What would be that super sticky thought that nobody can stop thinking about, that they need to remember when we're talking about the future of America and political polarization?
Well, I would say we all want democracy and the American dream. We just don't agree on how to get there or what it means. But because we all still want those things, underneath all those disagreements, we still have a lot in common.
Thank you for coming out. Thank you for being a sport. Thanks for taking the questions. I'll send you a copy of the interview. I hope you felt it was fair, and I didn't, box you in or anything. If you know anybody else who'd be willing to do an interview on political polarization, I'd love to talk to them. Our goal is to talk to as many people as possible and have their thoughts unedited and unaltered directly to the public. So I'll email you in a couple hours, and I want to say thank you for your time, Professor.
Thanks for having me on. It's great to be here. Great to answer your questions.
Thank you.